This is a first in a series of talks about the Sociology of Philosophies, a book by Randall Collins about the sociology and the history of philosophies from the perspective of groups of philosophers doing philosophy together. This is Randall Collins. He was born in 1941, and this book, The Sociology of Philosophies, A Global Theory of Intellectual Change, was published in 1998. This is about halfway through his lengthy career in sociology, and he worked on it for about 25 years on and off. At about 900 pages just by the text itself, and almost 1100 pages including the appendices and the index contents, it's safe to say that this is a voluminous, very contentful piece of work, and I think it's his magnum opus. This is the first section of the entire book that he presents here, and it also presents the very first thesis that he bases the rest of the book on. Intellectual life is, first of all, conflict and disagreement. Intellectual conflict is always limited by focus on certain topics and by the search for allies. Not warring individuals, but a small number of warring camps is the pattern of intellectual history. Conflict is the energy source of intellectual life, and conflict is limited by itself. And so this is how he starts off the book, that intellectual life is conflict and disagreement. And he points out that this is very unusual as a first glance impression of intellectual life, especially if you've primarily been exposed to intellectual life from the perspective of a student or a teacher, which most of us has been, because the experience of teaching and learning is collaborative, whereas Collins says the life of the intellectual in the world of academic innovation where real work is being done, so to speak, is all about conflict and disagreement, not about coming together in agreement. And what he means by this has three components. First of all, that intellectual innovation itself is driven by competition and conflict. It's driven by discussion among oppositions, as in different positions that one might take around the same argument. And these oppositions are made up of groups rather than individuals. Collins again points out that it's easy to caricature intellectual life as a competition between individuals, between great thinkers, geniuses, rather than groups of thinkers, which must, in this case, actually be working together. So here, Collins is primarily focusing on the groups as the units, and so he'll be using the language of conflict rather than cooperation or collaboration, which would be the case were we looking at the dynamics within the groups more than between the groups. But we'll get to that along within later chapters later on as we read more of the book. And I'll bring in other thinkers that present different perspectives on the same matter. And finally, most interestingly for us as meme scholars, is that conflict both drives intellectual life and limits itself. Now, why is that interesting for us specifically? Well, consider that Darwin himself finally came to be able to put together his full picture of natural selection as the driving force behind evolution upon reading Thomas Malthus' theory of Malthusian competition within a group, within a field of limited resources, wherein the population of organisms that are competing for resources in a given environment is increasing exponentially in size, in numbers, whereas the amount of resources that can go around for the individuals can only increase arithmetically, eventually leading to what is known as the Malthusian catastrophe, wherein, like a population of bacteria growing on a petri dish eventually killing itself off by drowning in its own refuse, the population itself starves itself because its growth outpaces the amount of resources that it can produce or cultivate for itself. And in the same way, we can think of intellectual life as presented by Collins as a sort of necessarily self-limiting competition with the amount of resources, namely attention, that can go around for the thinkers, limiting itself, as well as limiting the number of different groups that can arise within the population. Randall Collins' theory that underpins the entire book is called interaction ritual chains. The interaction ritual chain theory presented by Randall Collins in a standalone book later on as well is a radicalization of the sociologist Erving Goffman's interaction ritual theory. Now, before I go further into detail about interaction rituals and interaction ritual chains, I want to define radicalization because I use a very specific definition of radicalization. I define radicalization as the territorial expansion of a concept, a principle, or a worldview that forces substantive, accommodating changes within existing domains. What do I mean by this? Well, when you introduce a new concept or a new belief or a new principle into an existing orthodoxy, you have to take into account that there might arise some conflict between the new beliefs introduced into the existing domain and the beliefs that have already been entrenched within that domain. And so the very first step of radicalization is picking out a belief in order to apply it to a different domain from which this belief originated, or expanding the scope of this belief within the domain that it originates within. And so a belief is established in one domain and is often applied to another domain or a subdomain within that same domain. And this imported new belief is given priority. So when inconsistency arises between this new radicalizing belief and the existing sets of beliefs within this domain into which it is imported, the radical gives priority to the new belief, whereas the conservative will reject the new belief in favor of the orthodoxy. And this radicalization process of giving priority to the new belief whenever there is a conflict between the new and the old beliefs leads to unexpected consequences that changes the orthodoxy in some significant way. Or it leads to a rejection of that orthodoxy in favor of a new system that can accommodate the new belief that is being attempted to be fit into the orthodoxy and failing. And this radicalization process can be along any number of epistemological lines. Essentially, radicalization is an epistemologically agnostic process. Any number of epistemologies can radicalize or conserve. But this is most commonly done through coherentist lines because the most powerful driving factor behind radicalization is pointing out that there are inconsistencies between this new belief, which seems, say, intuitively self-justifying, and the orthodoxy that we've hitherto taken to be self-justifying. And so coherentist attacks are most common, and this is also the most common way that ordinary lay philosophies lead to radicalization, because inconsistencies are almost universally taken as a sign that something is wrong with a theory and that something has to be done in order to rectify it. But successful foundationalist attacks on the very foundations of an existing orthodoxy often has a radicalizing effect, because if the foundations are rotten about a theory, then it must be that the rest of the theory that leads on from that foundation must have something wrong with it. And here I want to emphasize that this is my personal definition, a very specific definition, and it disagrees with a lot of other usages of the term radicalization, but it is also in agreement with the way that the term is used in contemporary analytic political philosophy, which I think is the most fruitful way for us to use this term here. And this radicalization process is an important philosophical mechanic through which the history of philosophy unfolds, as we'll see in the subsequent readings. But also, it's a powerful intellectual technique. And Collins, as I mentioned, uses it in order to develop his own theory of the process driving intellectual history, namely interaction ritual chains. And he's going to be relying on this process of radicalization over and over in order to make a lot of his points and in order to develop a new theory. So I want us to keep this one in mind. In order to describe his interaction ritual chain theory, which is his original theory of how intellectuals form intellectual histories across the generations, Collins presents 4 opposing views that can contrast with his interaction ritual chain theory. And these 4 views are: A. Ideas beget ideas. B. Individuals beget ideas. C. Culture begets itself. D. Everything is fluid. And I've analyzed which units each of these ideas or each of these views focuses on and which level it seems to be placed in terms of its analytical lens. This table is not from Collins' work. This is my original interpretation of him, so just take it with a grain of salt. First of all, the notion that ideas beget ideas. Of course, we're quite familiar with this one, being interested in the mimetic theory of culture. The unit here is the idea, and the level at which the production of ideas as a consequence of the interaction between other ideas is placed is at the micro-sociological level. Namely, it happens within individual brains. And at one point in the introduction, Collins does briefly mention this notion that ideas jump across from one brain to another, propagating themselves. But I think he means it in a metaphorical sense rather than in a literal sense, because he doesn't actually subscribe to that theory. But this is a very powerful, compelling idea, that it's the ideas themselves that are the primary units of intellectual change across the generations in history. Collins, of course, rejects this view. Second, individuals beget ideas. He calls this a heroic image of the intellectual life, as in the caricature of intellectuals as either being heroic geniuses or nobodies who either do or don't contribute to the production of new ideas, and often work as solitary hermits that are producing books and bringing them down into the rest of the world, should we be so lucky, but otherwise being limited to working in isolation. He points out that individuals must necessarily have a connection to a broader intellectual network, and must also necessarily have an intellectual connection to other intellectuals in order to both be able to propagate their ideas and influence other intellectuals who are ultimately their primary audience, as well as being able to source the ingredients for the ideas that they're generating. We'll get into this in much more greater detail very soon. And the third view, culture begets itself. What he means by culture here is not the same thing as the amorphous blob of ideas, which we might infer from the first view being presented here, that ideas beget ideas. No, culture here means everything from the superstructure of society, the belief systems that influence everybody within a social group as a result of their ethnic or religious origins, or perhaps their class origins. And so Collins is rejecting the view that the higher level, namely the macro-sociological level, determines the ideas that occur at the micro level, namely of intellectual exchange. And the final, by the way, people are mesosociological in their level. And the individuals beget ideas is taking the individual person as its primary unit. And the fourth view here, I think it's not even a coherent view according to Collins' description. It's a sort of postmodern anti-structuralist view that you can't even impose these kinds of perspectives on the analysis of intellectual life. And so any such form, not just that any given view is incorrect, but any such view along these lines will inevitably be incorrect. And so the unit is indeterminate, the level is indeterminate. You cannot determine the unit or the level at which analysis of culture and intellectual change will be correct. The interaction ritual chain theory that Collins puts forth occurs through two channels that chain onto each other: the exchange of emotional energy and the exchange of cultural capital. And so these are microsociological processes in the sense that they occur at the face-to-face level. So Erving Goffman's interaction ritual theory was a sociology of personal interactions. He called it a microsociology because unlike the analysis of culture at a broader scale, at the scale of class interactions, at the scale of, say, the division of labor within entire societies, or the operation of states and state apparatuses, Goffman was presenting the view that personal interactions at the micro level should have its own theoretical frameworks within which their sociologies should be analyzed. Now, I want to go into a little more detail here about Erving Goffman's theory. Erving Goffman made it very clear, he emphasized again and again that the macro-sociological, namely the evolution of culture and the organization of society, should not be reduced down to his micro-sociological theory. In fact, he said that you cannot analyze the macro-sociological level phenomena with the lens of the micro-sociological. You have to have your separate frameworks for analyzing the macro-sociological and the micro-sociological. But Collins, being the radical that he is, radicalizing Goffman's theory into the form of interaction ritual chains, does propose that you can analyze the macro-sociological from the perspective of the micro-sociological. And so he thinks that the macro-sociological phenomenon of intellectual change, of the evolution of philosophy across thousands of years, can be reduced down to the micro-sociological level of interactions between groups of individuals involved in the intellectual life. So, according to Collins, macrosociology is reduced to microsociology, and interaction ritual chains facilitate competition within limited attention spaces. As I mentioned earlier about his theory that conflict is a driving factor behind intellectual life. And so, according to Collins, even the human mind itself is constituted by the interaction ritual chains. And these interaction ritual chains are one's personal history of interaction rituals. They're a series of interaction rituals that one undergoes over and over, participates in over and over. Many different types of interaction rituals come together in the individual's mind to form the vocabulary that the individual carries with himself or herself throughout their life in order to have a sort of perpetual simulation of the world within which they live within is. And so the mind, as in the view that individuals beget ideas, or as in the view that the ideas beget ideas, is still reduced down further into a more generalizable unit not of groups, but of the activities that occur within these groups called interaction rituals. So, what are interaction rituals, of which we've been discussing over and over? Here are the ingredients of an interaction ritual. Every interaction ritual necessarily involves these ingredients. First, a group of at least 2 people is physically assembled. But as I will bring up in later chapters, in discussions of later chapters, more recent analyses based on Collins' theory of interaction ritual chains have analyzed whether virtual assemblies of people, namely on the internet, also can facilitate interaction rituals. And they seem to be quite positive that this can facilitate interaction rituals in a highly effective way. You can imagine that both the scale and the experience, the phenomenological experience of interaction ritual chains that occur virtually will be quite different, but also have similar impacts on the participants as face-to-face interactions. But Collins is quite adamant that at least textual exchanges cannot be a substitute for face-to-face interactions and interaction rituals. 2, they focus attention on the same object or action, and each becomes aware that the other is maintaining this focus. You can imagine in a religious ritual, everybody is congregated around the same, say, idol or a shrine, directing their veneration towards the singular object. And the fact that everybody else in the room is directing their veneration towards the same singular object encourages feelings of religious awe within each and every individual. 3, they share a common mood or emotion. 4, the mutual focus of attention and the shared mood cumulatively intensify. So the more these individuals in a group participate in the shared mood and emotion that is directed towards this object of veneration, the more intense the ritual itself becomes. 5, as a result, the participants feel they are members of a group with moral obligations to one another. It's not just any feeling. For example, just working together, or say engaging in trade, or walking down the street together. It's not an interaction ritual. It has to be something that binds the group together in shared feeling. And this is very specific, this moral obligation. Collins, inheriting from Goffman, is giving a Durkheimian view of rituals here, wherein these people involved in rituals in a group are involved in a sort of religious experience. And the object of intense emotional focus in an interaction ritual is a sacred object. 6, individuals who participate in interaction rituals are filled with emotional energy in proportion to the intensity of the interaction. And interaction ritual chains, as I mentioned earlier, are an individual's history of ritual participation. So it's not just a single interaction ritual, but it has to be an entire history of the rituals that their individual has participated in up to that point that we analyzed the individual. And through interaction ritual chains, individuals develop personal repertoires of symbols. What does Collins mean by this? Well, individuals learn to speak a given language through a series of conversations rather than through just a singular conversation. And the way that individuals acquire language is through the acquisition of vocabularies, of grammatical rules, but also of things that aren't syntactically obvious just from looking at the rules of language. There are also connotations and implications and subtleties attached to the words. There's also the nuances of when to use different words with which person and what it means when you use the words, and what it means for you specifically as the participant in this culture, this lingua culture, the culture that forms around the language, what it means for you to speak in the particular way that you do. What does it mean for you? What kind of a member of the group are you speaking the way that you do? Well, these symbols, each and every one of these words, have some significance regarding this particular point of your membership significance. And these symbols vary in abstraction or reification, how abstract or how concrete and real it is, how general or how particular they are. So does a word or a symbol apply across lots and lots of different hypothetical or real instances within which it can be applied, or is it narrowly confined to specific instances? And how far removed is it from everyday ordinary life? In the case of intellectuals, as you can imagine, the symbols that they most venerate, the symbols that they most cherish as their objects of worship within their interaction rituals, are highly abstract and highly generalized. Intellectuals' ideas are supposed to be true across time and space, typically speaking. And these are the objects of the intellectual life. Individuals vary emotionally over the long term, in their confidence, in their enthusiasm, in their initiative, in their self-feelings, and these feelings are not transient. The feelings, the emotions that Collins is focusing on here, called emotional energy, are not transient. These are long-term feelings. We'll cover more of that in a minute. Cultural capital is one half of the ingredients that go into interaction rituals. Cultural capital, as defined by Collins, is an individual's personal repertoire of symbols loaded with membership significance used in the competition for attention. So you can see that individuals acquire cultural capital through interaction ritual chains, in the same way that individuals acquire new vocabularies through interactions. And indeed, I think Collins would say that language itself is a form of cultural capital, and it's especially important for an intellectual or an academic to be able to speak in the lingua franca of the particular group of intellectual spheres that they're involved within, because the jargons that they're fluent within, the shibboleths of their academic careers, both signal and enable access to particular memberships that give them access to cultural capital. And so you can imagine that having access to a lot of cultural capital already unlocks access to even more cultural capital. And because cultural capital is used in competition for attention, it's a highly sought after resource within intellectual life, or in any form of cultural life for that matter. High levels of creativity become crystallized in symbols, and what he means by this is that creativity, namely the putting together of cultural capital into new forms, becomes fixed around a given symbol, which comes to stand in for the broader scope of the ideas that lie behind that particular symbol. And these symbols, for example, the theory of natural selection, the theory of found herentism, coherentism, these kinds of very particular intellectual theories or symbols, relativism, objectivism, they stand in for the the creativity that drove these ideas to come into existence, but also the ideas themselves. And they circulate through the intellectual field. They're being passed on from one individual to another or between groups of thinkers across the generations, in most significantly as components of published texts that the intellectuals exchange with one another. And so they circulate between the intellectuals, and they energize the people that attach themselves to them closely, because the ideas are exciting. The ideas are useful. The ideas enable the individuals to do even more work, to succeed even further within their work of academic life and competition amongst the groups of academics. And individuals can also become sacred symbols for groups, not just ideas. Not just the theory of class conflict, but Karl Marx becomes the symbol that is functionally the same as the high levels of creativity that became crystallized in symbols, because these individuals provide a point of high agreement for the participants of a given group. And these individuals play the dual role of the hero and the symbol. As symbols, they circulate like any other ideas and any other symbols through the intellectual field, energizing the people that attach themselves to them and use them in their own works. But also, they become models of intellectual heroism. Namely, how do I become like that? And also, how do I challenge these heroes and move beyond them? And so they provide the point at which less experienced, less successful academics can aim and mold themselves on the image of. Emotional energy is the kind of strength that comes from participating successfully in an interaction ritual. This is the most important emotion for Randall Collins in his theory of interaction ritual chains. It's the most important emotion for its effect on these chains, and it's the most important in the theory. This emotional energy, this feeling of high emotional energy, comes upon creatives when they're doing the best work, and it enables them to go on working for extended periods of time with intense focus and concentration. In a later book called Napoleon Never Slept, Collins talks about the fact that extremely high amounts of creativity were driven by equivalently high levels of emotional energy. And this was particularly true in the case of great leaders such as Napoleon or Churchill. And he gives the example of Churchill as only living on little naps throughout the day and otherwise being focused on his work at all times. And Napoleon, he says, rarely slept for more than 4 hours at a time, and this was during peacetime. These emotional energies are not transient, dramatic ups and downs of outbursts of emotion like fear, joy, anger, horror. These are extended across days, weeks, months, even years, decades. Levels of emotional energy characterize an individual's entire career. Different social markets, different fields, intellectual fields have distinct types of emotional energy. So you can't be using the emotional energy that would be good for making music for doing accounting work, say. Maybe there's some leeway. Presumably, people with high levels of emotional energy in one field are more likely to be able to develop high levels of emotional energy in other fields, but they're not interchangeable. A continuum from low to high characterizes these emotional energies. So at the low points, you can be depressed, dejected, disillusioned about the work, always having some sort of issues in your life that prevents you from doing work. And at the other end, you can have high levels of emotional energy. Seemingly, you're never tired, you're always inspired. Anything you read inspires you. Any book that you come across, well, I assume they have to be good books that are relevant to your field, has to be interesting, exciting, inspiring even more creativity. Other people's works don't intimidate you, they excite you and inspire you to do more work or better work. And emotional energy fluctuates depending on your recent social experience. Intense ritual participation raises emotional energy. Rejection, on the other hand, lowers it. Dominating a group raises it, but being dominated likewise lowers it. And most interestingly, I think, membership in high-ranking groups raises it more than membership in low-ranking groups. So participating in rituals within high-ranking groups as someone who's being dominated or is otherwise on the lower rungs might be much better off for an individual in terms of their total emotional energy payoff than trying to dominate a low-ranking group. Intellectual interaction rituals are specific forms of interaction rituals. Interaction ritual chains that the intellectuals participate in are specific in terms of both the object of veneration and the particular ingredients of the ritual, as well as the activities that the participants engage in within that ritual. Intellectual interaction rituals are rituals within which intellectuals gather to focus their attention for a time on one of their members who delivers a sustained discourse, as you are doing right now. And this is very interesting because, unlike in ordinary conversations, the back and forth is happening with a much greater degree of latency. So, in normal conversations, if someone decides to go on for minutes at a time without giving the other person a turn to speak, this is a very uncouth. It's inappropriate. It's a very rude thing to do, to monologue at someone, to dump information on someone without giving the other person a turn to speak. But because the topics change so quickly within conversations, and because nobody gets to go on for extended periods of time like in a lecture, the amount of abstraction and generalization and the, frankly, sophistication that can develop within ordinary conversation is highly limited, whereas the cap or the ceiling is much higher for intellectual interaction rituals. The sacred object, and again, this is a Durkheimian lens on rituals, the sacred object of intellectuals is truth itself. Capital T, truth. And this, as Collins points out in his attack on postmodernism in the introduction, this still remains the case even when the intellectual is attacking truth itself and suggesting that perhaps we should replace truth with some other object in our rituals as the sacred object. I would love to go into more detail on this because I love Richard Rorty, and a lot of his work is essentially taking exactly this form of an attack on capital T truth. But I would say that even Richard Rorty is squarely within the confines of Randall Collins' theory of intellectual interaction rituals, perhaps more than many other academics, if anything, because in his attack on metaphysics, I think Rorty is sort of laying bare the ritual nature of academic interactions. Attention structured around giving sustained attention to a single viewpoint at a time characterizes interaction rituals, intellectual interaction rituals. So, as I mentioned, they're different from ordinary conversations. They're also different from religious worship or subordination. Subordination as in You're getting told off at work and you're being given a scolding. Because, unlike in religious worship or in subordination, the intellectuals in the audience, in the crowd, are not passive recipients or losing themselves in the ritual in the same way that religious worshippers are. They're also active participants in the ritual, even though they're not speaking. It's not their turn yet, but in their minds, they're already thinking about, does this lecture benefit my theory? Does this lecture fit into my theory somehow? How can I respond to this lecture's contents? Is there something useful in there that I can take and use? What does this mean in terms of my my relationships with other academics, namely in the alliances and oppositions within the field? And so the audience in an intellectual interaction ritual are active participants. And intellectual interaction rituals require specific logistics. Why? Because the book or the written text is vital for the intellectual life. And so there's necessarily the need for a way to distribute written or published printed text to readers. An autonomous network for intellectual communication. And intellectual interaction ritual chains failed to come into existence in its full form until printing and until writing and the distribution of writing was invented. So there's a strict limitation imposed here in terms of purely oral traditions. Intellectuals require written texts. Why? Because written texts allow intellectuals to transcend the immediate present now, move beyond face-to-face interaction rituals into abstraction and generality that stretches across time and space, both in terms of communication across continents, but also across the generations over hundreds of years. Nonetheless, interaction rituals, even amongst intellectuals, are face-to-face in their primary focus, despite the fact that the published texts are so important to the intellectuals. Why? Because sacred objects in the Durkheimian sense can only be created and sustained as in re-energized over and over, charged up with emotional energy over and over by ceremonial gatherings and worship. Otherwise, again in the Durkheimian sense, these become dead religious objects. These texts become descriptions of dead religions with no living worshippers. They become relics. And these face-to-face interactions for the intellectuals are lectures, conferences, discussions in classrooms, and debates. Lectures and texts are chained together. So lectures happen and then texts, often the texts are based on the lectures, as in the lectures are already in preparation for being published, and then the texts being read and critiqued and absorbed by the intellectuals leads to more lectures, and more these lead to more texts, and again over and over, forming a unique social activity for the intellectuals. Thinking is most centrally internalized conversation. What someone thinks about is determined by the intensity of recent experience in interaction rituals and by the interactions which one anticipates most immediately for the future. This is a really cool quote from Collins. It's very interesting. He's saying that even when we're alone in our thoughts, we're not actually alone. We're always bookended by interaction rituals that we've already had in the past and interaction rituals that we anticipate in the future. And these interaction rituals that we remember and simulate come together and constitute the ingredients as well as the environment of our own thoughts. And all of this takes place within the intellectual field. There are three characteristics of an intellectual field according to Collins, as in the networks of intellectuals takes the form of these three distinct kinds of structures. First of them is intellectual groups. The intellectual field is characterized by groups of intellectuals forming rather than a scattered series of individuals working in isolation. These intellectual groups are often groups of friends or discussion partners, say you're in the same cohort of a class, or they're tight-knit social circles, which often have the characteristics of social movements. And an example that he gives is the group of post-Kantians, composed of thinkers such as Victor Schelling, Hegel, some of whom lived together, and whenever one of them found success, they pulled the others along. Intellectual groups, in order to be successful, requires two types of leaders: an intellectual leader and an organizational leader. And these two are not necessarily in the same person. They can be different people. In the case of the post-Kantians, Kant was actually the intellectual leader, but the organizational leader, this was kind of ambiguous, because this group has a lot of drama going on within themselves, and they sort of took turns being the organizational leader. But Kant, being the older and not really in direct contact with this intellectual network, aside from, I think, Victor, was nonetheless the intellectual leader of this broad network, of this broad intellectual group. Second characteristic of intellectual fields are master-pupil chains. These master-pupil chains are intergenerational chains of thinkers. They form on the basis of eminent teachers giving rise to eminent pupils. And Collins points out that creativity is not random among individuals. It builds up across the generations through interaction ritual chains that go from one generation into the next. And these master-pupil chains pass on some of the most important cultural capital from one generation to another, from one thinker to another. Namely, how to engage with the intellectual field itself. How to get a feel for who your enemies are and who your allies are. How to introduce your ideas into the field in the right format and in the right moments. And how to acquire more cultural capital and put it to good use. And the last and third characteristic of intellectual fields are structural rivalries. These arise when major philosophical rivalries form, and these often come in pairs or trios of major philosophers. And as we discussed earlier, the philosophers can simultaneously be heroes and symbols that a group of thinkers form around. And so contemporaneously developed rival positions characterize a significant portion of what an intellectual field itself is. Rivalries produce conflicts, and conflicts, according to Collins, are implicitly the most prized positions of intellectuals, because they enable new, fresh, original positions to emerge, which the intellectuals can stake out. They reveal possibilities of thought. And Collins says the history of philosophy is not of problems solved, but the discovery of exploitable lines in opposition. This is a very interesting way to characterize philosophy. This might seem like a more apt description of, say, the hard sciences, wherein we could suppose that, yes, the laws of nature already existed and were its mere discoverers. But in the more abstract sciences, or the more abstract humanities or the arts, it seems puzzling to say that we're discovering things. It has a strangely Platonic implication. But I think it's not necessarily the case. I think the correct analogy to go by here is that we're discovering new niches that we can inhabit. And here we're going to be looking at why conflict limits itself. So, according to Collins, the intellectual field is limited by the law of small numbers. The number of rival positions at the forefront of intellectual creativity are always about 3 to 6. He's very specific about this here. Why? Because he's going off of the of his empirical study of eminence that is conducted on the thinkers, namely by looking at how many pages of space in the histories of philosophy have different biographers afforded to each individual thinker, and how many say offspring works of philosophy have these thinkers' works produced, namely things that build on top of their works. So he's saying that according to his cutoff points of eminence, it turned out that there happens to be 3 to 6 major rival positions. There can of course be indefinitely high numbers of rival positions if we count any given disagreement as its own rival position, but he's talking about eminence, significant, great works of philosophies and groups that had major effect on the history of the philosophy in the subsequent generations. Why is this the case? Well, attention spaces, which is what Randall Collins calls the niche of intellectuals within which each individual thinker can give so much attention to other thinkers, are limited in capacity for knots of an argument. Knots of arguments are different positions that can be staked out in a given argument. Once a few arguments partition the population, as in divide the population into the knots, attention is withdrawn from potential new knots of argument. Why? Because it just becomes the case that it's not worth it anymore for the intellectuals that are already involved in this field to attach themselves to a new, smaller, argumentative movement that doesn't have enough traction going on for itself in order to derive sufficient amounts of cultural capital and emotional energy to make up for the opportunity cost of being involved in an already established knot of argument. Oftentimes, great, valuable, highly creative, in the general colloquial sense, highly creative arguments might come into being, but fail to take off because the timing is wrong. The field is already too saturated, and so Collins says often timing is everything for advancing an argument. Both argument formation and lineage formation, as in disagreement and agreement as strategies of involving oneself in the intellectual field, go on simultaneously. The fact that individuals have to necessarily exist in lineages in order to learn anything that they can use in their own arguments means that both have to go on simultaneously, because they have to have something that they've learned if they want to have something to argue about. The cultural capital that is accumulated and utilized within these knots of arguments is what entices new members into the movements that form around the different knots of arguments. There are two strategies for gaining attention in the intellectual field. As I mentioned, forming arguments and forming lineages. Forming arguments means contradicting another thinker that has their own arguments being put forth, or joining a dispute by participating in an already existing dispute. And so this particular strategy results in groups that are focused on rival arguments. Forming lineages is the master-pupil chains that I mentioned earlier, and this is agreeing with another thinker's work. So if forming arguments takes the form of no, but, the forming lineages takes the form of yes, and furthermore, and these lead to teacher-pupil lineages. Cultural capital and emotional energy are resources within constrained markets. Individuals are always seeking to maximize their emotional energy. This is how they choose between the numerous different interaction rituals that are always available to them whenever they're participating in public life, as well as in private when they're engaging with different texts. So the gain and loss of emotional energy depends on how much cultural capital and how much emotional energy other people that you interact with has to offer to you. And because you're also engaging with the other person along the same lines, and you have your own cultural capital and you have your own emotional energy, the two of you, every time you meet with another intellectual in the field, are bargaining. Why? Because the emotional energy and the cultural capital that every person has is different, both in terms of kind and in terms of levels. So it's an asymmetrical process. You might be interacting with someone who knows absolutely nothing about your profession and has a terribly low level of emotional energy, and it would be disadvantageous for you to interact with this person and network with this person compared to going and engaging with your professor who has both high cultural capital and high emotional energy. You will gain a lot more from engaging with your professor than someone who doesn't care about the topic of your profession. And so, because cultural capital and emotional energy is gained from interactions that you have with individuals in your interaction rituals, and they determine what you can even do. Why? Remember that your own private thoughts, even when you're away from the interaction rituals, are nonetheless determined by your past and projected future interaction rituals. Your thoughts are constituted by cultural capital and emotional energy that you gain from interacting with others. It's very important for a thinker to make the right choices of whom they engage with. So, the most important network feature here for Collins is how this open bargaining process stratifies the attention space. It divides up the attention space, it divides up the intellectual field into different rankings of thinkers in an organic way as a result of the bargaining process within the constrained market. And so each person is trying to get the most out of their interaction rituals, trying to get the best in terms of their intellectual status membership. This is both direct in terms of who you're choosing to interact with, and indirect in terms of who you're connected through other people within a broader group. And so the negotiation of alliances it goes both ways, and it also is ongoing, and it's asymmetrical. And there are two strategies for gaining eminence in the intellectual field. You could go for the king of the mountain strategy, as in you're trying to become the top dog in a knot of argument, of a major knot of argument, not a minor one. You're trying to be at the center of a major position, and this means you're going to be alone or nearly alone because you're trying to outcompete everyone else. And you're trying to compete within a highly recognized and highly competitive topic. It's a very challenging, difficult thing to do. And this fact that it's very difficult gives rise to the secondary or alternative strategy of becoming a loyal follower to an existing position, and you're contributing something significant but minor compared to being the center of the argumentative knot. And you're contributing to an active research front. You're participating in a less recognized role. Perhaps you're specializing in a less exciting and promising field because it has less competition. So there are different levels of stratification among the scientists. Collins is giving the example of the scientists here because he's positing that the stratification among the philosophers will be roughly the same in terms of its structure as the scientists. And the scientists are the bibliometric data is much better documented and much better available. At the top, a very small absolute number of scientists who are the scientific stars, the Einsteins. And in the inner core is the 1 to 2% of the total floating population, as in the total population of all scientists who have contributed at least one publication in their lifetime. And the outer core is about 20%, and the transients who go in and out of contributing to the literature. They're not full-time, they're not consistently publishing works year after year. They constitute about 75% to 80%, and the rest of the audience in the world are anywhere from 10 to 100 times the total floating population of the academics that have already at least published one work. There are 3 career level barriers that stop the potential recruits from entering the field. First of all is getting your first publication out there, which admits you into the scientific community and separates you from the layperson or the to-be recruits. Oftentimes this is the PhD work. And the next few publications present the second hurdle. This puts the scientist into the intermediate group of transients or potential continuants who continue on to publish work and become stable, part of the stable core of the scientists. And transients are rarely cited, and even when they are cited, they're not cited repeatedly. And the third hurdle is 5 years of continuing publication. I'm not quite sure why he set the cutoff point at 5 years here, but I think it probably gives the clearest view of where the cutoff point is in terms of who's really committed and who's not. This puts one into the high-producing elite, or the core. 20% of active, not the total floating population, but only 1 to 2% of the total floating population is this elite or core group of scientists. And this core group produces 1/4 of all publications that exist in the scientific field. There's a limited access to cultural capital, which is an important major component of what limits competition and conflict within the intellectual field. So, access to core productive cultural capital is limited by access to core networks. What does Collins mean by this? Well, productive capital, the most valuable cultural capital, is that which contributes to future competition for attention, which is the bread and butter of intellectual life. It's always about competition for attention, but of course, Collins makes clear that using anything other than good, honest intellectual work will inevitably ultimately lead to poor judgment by history, and so it's a poor strategy for eminence, because you'll inevitably be found out and be discarded by the intellectual community. But attention gained along legitimate channels, namely by the production of new creative ideas that are useful for other academics, is the most valuable. And the most valuable form of attention can be gained by having access to the most valuable cultural capital and high levels of emotional energy with which to make use of that valuable cultural capital. And this valuable cultural capital is monopolized by the core networks of thinkers. Why? Some individuals always have more access to cultural capital than others. Intellectuals and social connections of those intellectuals enable that access to cultural capital, and better cultural capital that is monopolized by the core. And this monopoly of cultural capital isn't just to do with things like limited access to the papers themselves, or having access to the libraries, or being able to understand the works. No, this goes beyond what is within reach for the autodidact. A lot of the most valuable, treasured, and guarded cultural capital is tacit or meta-level knowledge, which cannot be passed on through written text alone. Namely, which parts of the total literature that is available is most relevant and valuable for the ongoing present conversation within the intellectual field. Just arbitrarily browsing publications, doing a search on Google Scholar and so on, will just lead to being overloaded rather than focusing your attention on what's the right work to familiarize yourself with, and it will be counterproductive. Familiarity and access to the tools themselves, the technologies being used in research, and the infrastructures, which are often sizable and expensive and can only be accessed and utilized by select limited personnel on site, the very capacity to use these tools and resources are passed on by personal contact and not by published papers. These are informal, almost not quite ineffable, but they're not topics of published papers. You cannot learn this through just reading books or reading papers. You cannot teach yourself. Thinking is a fantasy play of membership inside one's own mind. It is a maneuvering for the best symbolic payoff one can get, using energies derived from recent social interactions and anticipations of future encounters. Again, Collins is talking about the constitution of the mind as being made up of the past and future interaction rituals that one has and will likely participate in. And he gives the example of language itself as a ritual. And his theory of language is very peculiar. It's very interesting. He uses analogies with 20th century analytic philosophy, namely Fregean philosophy, of the meaning of words, where meaning comes from for words, in order to illustrate his point. And he uses a very different set of definitions for the sense of words and the reference of words from Frege. Language, according to Collins, is a product of ritual. Words, as in symbols that make up the life of the language, are collective representations, and they're loaded with moral significance in the same way that any other ritual object or any other sacred object within a ritual are. They're loaded with moral significance. And what this means is that they take on, the objects loaded with moral significance take on the sense that there's something beyond the object itself that imposes laws onto how you interact with that object. The violation of the rules that are imposed this way, or seemingly imposed onto the object in this way, triggers a moral outrage in the participants of these rituals. So, the violation of linguistic rules, or grammatical rules, or spelling or pronunciation evokes a sort of outrage in the fluent speaker. Why? Because words are sacred objects. You've just violated the rules that are attached to the sacred object of the words by mispronouncing a word or using the word incorrectly. And Collins says that this very fact of outrage that is attached to the way that we use words is evidence of the fact that these words are sacred objects and the ritual of language. So, in order to further develop his theory that language is ritual, Collins gives his own definitions of reference and sense. And the sense-reference distinction originates from Frege's analysis of where meaning comes from for words. And frankly, Collins is using the definitions incorrectly, which I think evokes a sort of moral outrage in myself as an analytically trained philosopher. But his definition of reference is what words point at beyond a given segment of conversation. As in, when you're having a conversation or an interaction ritual, the words are attached to something that is outside the confines of their local interaction. Each of the words that you use in a conversation are sort of networked to other potential experiences or phenomena that you might experience, or the other participant might experience, or might potentially think about. And the sense of the words are the symbolic connection of the words and all of the linguistic interaction that you're having in general to the broader social situation, the entire context that is surrounding that local interaction, both the past and the present current usage of the words that you know to be true, that you know to be occurring, even as you participate in this one localized interaction. You know that the words that you're using has been used in a certain way, has certain connotations, and other people in the same group as you, who share the social solidarity based partially on the common language that you use, are going to be making use of the symbols in the same way. And Frege, on the other hand, defines sense as the meaning of words, which is strictly a property of the words themselves, and reference as the objects out there in the world to which the words may or may not point. Why may not? Because the referent may not even exist. You can talk about a unicorn and put together a coherent sentence, but nonetheless, the referent of the unicorn does not exist. You can talk about things using different names that have different meanings. His famous example is the morning star and the evening star, which are actually both the same planet that can be seen in the morning and in the evening. And the meaning of the words are different because the ancients thought of them as separate, distinct celestial bodies, whereas now we know them to be the same singular planet. And so the referent is shared between these two words of the separate, distinct meanings. When people talk, they're conscious mainly of what they are talking about, i.e. its reference, and only subliminally of the social motivations that determine what they say, i.e. its sense. And so here it's very clear what Collins is doing with the different definitions of sense and reference. Namely that on the one hand, the reference is something more concrete and within reach for the individual who is engaging in the actual localized face-to-face interaction within which the language itself is being used. But how that language is being used is the real source of meaning for Collins. The network within which this particular conversation is situated is the source of the meaning for even the words within the conversation itself. And this is a micro form of Collins' theory of the broader network of intellectuals. For Collins, thinking is a fantasy. Why? Thinking is internalized conversation that is a simulation of real conversations. Thinking is a fantasy play of membership. A fantasy play of membership within different interaction ritual giving groups of people, but simulated within one's own mind. So even in the confines of your skull, when you're thinking alone, you're nonetheless pretending that you're part of a group. You're pretending that you're having a group interaction. Thinking is driven by emotional loadings of symbols that are used within the thinking process. These symbols are charged up through rituals, charged up ceremonially, charged up with emotional energy, with markers for social membership. And so the thinking process is, in the same way as interaction rituals per se, driven by the same motivation for maximizing emotional energy and cultural capital even. And so when you're thinking, just as when you're choosing between interaction rituals, you're optimizing for emotional energy payoff. And why should this be the case? Well, it's trivial. Because thinking is a simulation of interaction rituals, you are simply engaging in a fantasy version of the actual process of choosing between potential interaction rituals. And so just as you're attempting to optimize your emotional energy payoff when you're choosing which person or which interaction rituals to engage in, when you're thinking, you're also trying to optimize your emotional energy payoff along the same lines. Thinking is a conversation with imaginary audiences, and the most creative intellectuals are the best at imagining audiences. They most realistically invoke intellectual audiences in their own mind, and the better you are at knowing your audience, the better you are, of course, going to be at simulating them, which means the most creative intellectuals have the most intimate knowledge of the audience and the most intimate knowledge of the intellectual network and the available creative cultural capital within that field. And creative intellectuals imagine not just any interaction rituals, but successful interaction rituals, just as they engage in the most successful interaction rituals in real life. And this gives them emotional energy that sustains them through extended periods of isolation as they work alone. And so thinkers are never truly alone in their minds. But just because thinking is a fantasy doesn't mean it's free for all. It's a fantasy that is based in social reality. You cannot sustain yourself on ungrounded delusions. This may be a tempting strategy to consider, namely, drive yourself into a frenzy and maximize your emotional energy, given that emotional energy is the thing that you're trying to maximize for. That's the primary utility that, apparently, according to Collins, you're trying to maximize for, both in your private, solitary thinking process, as well as your interaction and your choice of groups and individuals that you're connecting with. So why not just cut to the chase, skip to the conclusion, and maximize the emotional energy itself without having to go through the difficult process of accumulating cultural capital that is attractive to other thinkers who will then give you access to beneficial interaction rituals? Well, a thinker is limited both by their cognitive capabilities, as in how realistically they can imagine the interaction rituals, as well as the ingredients of their imagination, of their fantasies, namely what interaction rituals that they have already engaged in the past. So, thinking is a fantasy that is determined by the reality of actually experienced interaction rituals and plausible interaction rituals that you can project into the future. And interaction rituals themselves bolster the products of your private interaction rituals that you simulate within your own mind. So the products of your thoughts have to be imbued with emotional energy through being released and shared with other thinkers who are going to come and celebrate the products of your thoughts. And these sacred objects of your mind are going to be energized in actual real interaction rituals. And so, just as lectures and texts are chained together, thinking and interaction rituals are thus chained together and determine the reality of one another. They determine the scope, the contents, and the levels of emotional energy involved in one another. And so, because of the fact that they determine one another, you can't just engage in a delusion in order to maximize your emotional energy and turn yourself into a Napoleon. You have to actually be successful. You have to actually pay your dues. So, what are your thoughts? Do you think that the macro-level social phenomena of philosophies could neatly reduce down to the micro-level social phenomena of interaction rituals?